Okay, in this quick video, I want to talk about taxes. We see in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, that the federal government has given its right to itself for taxing. Taxing, however, is under the exclusive legislative jurisdiction of the federal government on federal lands, which means it has the right to tax the people on the federal lands only. The state has the right to tax the people on state lands. So if a person is receiving federal money for work that they're doing on federal lands, the federal government has the right to tax that federal income. The state is the same way, and the local is the same way. There is, however, something to do with property taxes, and I'll get to that in a minute. So we have the major taxes: income, wages, and property. Income is usually from other sources. Wages is from when you get paid by your employer, and then you have property taxes. So the federal government can tax the income and wages of federal employees. State can tax the income and wages of state employees, and the local governments can tax the income and wages of the local government employees. Property taxes may be for the rest of us. A couple of maxims that you want to look at for these are: no one can be both tenant and master. The federal government is the tenant in the state lands. Okay, so the federal government cannot then dictate that the state pay it taxes, or that state people pay it taxes, because it is a tenant on state lands. It can only tax the people on the federal lands because those people are tenants on federal lands. Same with the state and same with the local. Now, the properties is the ownership by private people, private citizens, okay? And fiction must yield to truth. So the fiction that all people have to pay a federal income has to yield to the truth. The truth is that you don't, because no one can be both tenant and master. The federal government cannot be master over people who are not tenants on its lands. And the federal government cannot be master of the state, because the federal government is a tenant on state lands. Same with the local. The local government is, or the state is the state is like a tenant on the local lands, and the people, the private people, are the ones who make up the local government, the state government. And then the state government make up the federal government. Property ought to be valued at the will of the owner. So these days, what the local governments do is they come and they value your property, and then they send you something, and then you have the right to dispute it. And some people do dispute it, and then they keep their taxes at a lower rate, whereas most people don't dispute it, and then their taxes go up. So property ought to be valued at the will of the owner. In early Roman law, the term give to Caesar what is Caesar's, which I believe is in the Bible, it doesn't mean that everyone has to pay a tax. What happened back then was that there were certain lands in the Roman Empire that were not owned. They were just common property. They were owned commonly by all the people. No one actually owned the land. So what Caesar did was he gave out some of those lands to the poorest people in the empire, and allowed them to cultivate it. As part of that agreement, these people paid a tax, and that tax was that they would give up part of their yields. Like when they had a crop and it yielded, let's say 10 bushels, they gave up 2 bushels to the government, so the government could feed the officials and the military members. So that was sort of like a rent or a lease, or the price of ownership. And so when people started fighting back and didn't want to pay that, then they were basically trying to steal the land that Caesar had lent to them. So they were tenants, and Caesar was still the master of the land. So they had to pay the price for being tenants on that land, and the price was to give up part of their yields to the government, and they agreed to that. They agreed to that from the beginning. So then when they didn't want to pay it, we got the common phrase, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. So in other words, do what's right. And it's not that paying taxes is right, but if you receive something, such as a piece of land that was given to you under a contract to provide some of your yields to the government, then that was the agreement, and so you had to do that. You had to pay your tax. Okay, you had to give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, because the property was common owned and gifted to you or lent to you or leased or rented to you in order for you to pay. So property tax ought to be valued at the will of the owner. So Caesar was considered the owner, and whatever they agreed the yield would be for the covering of the taxes, and that's what they had to yield back. So the federal government, if you've watched some of my other videos, you would understand that the federal government is limited in their jurisdiction, which is their lawmaking power, only onto the federal lands or the lands that they use that are in the states just for like roads passing by or some of their federal buildings or their banks and stuff. So the federal government was not allowed to make taxes for all of the lands that it uses. It was only allowed to make taxes for the federal lands that were given up completely and totally to the federal government. And those lands are located within the state. These are called the federal areas, islands, enclaves, federal areas within the state, usually military posts, but nowadays they just keep expanding and expanding and expanding, and then the states let them. Eventually, if they keep doing that, then the federal government's going to own everything, and there will be no fighting it. It'll just be one big government instead of states. But that's taxes. That's my little short video on taxes. There's a lot of maxims that go along with taxes and property and truths and lies, and which is proper and which is improper. And the federal government taxing the income, wages, or property of the people not on its lands is a fiction. Okay, it's not actually supposed to happen, but if you allow it, then they can say that they haven't done anything wrong because you allowed it. Okay?